The accusation hit as the kitchen clock clicked loud under the fluorescent glare. You chose a doctor over your own grandchild. I'm Callum Hensley, 54, an accountant gripping my father's smooth pocket watch still pristine. Ever faced a moment where doing the right thing made you the villain? The words still echo in my ears, though it's been hours. You chose a doctor over watching your grandchild. Lowell didn't shout. He didn't have to. His voice carried that quiet disappointment that cuts deeper than yelling ever could. I stood by the kitchen counter, my fingers tracing the cool rim of my coffee mug, but no words came. The November light slanted through the fogged window paning, pale streaks on the laminate floor, and I just felt hollow. My father's pocket watch was in my palm, its glass catching a slice of sunlight, and I flipped it open just to hear the faint tick like some anchor in the quiet storm. Then I closed it, slid it into my coat, and walked out without answering. The air outside had that damp late autumn smell, like wet leaves and cold iron. The cul-de-sac was nearly silent save for the gurgle of a clogged drain where maple leaves swirled in a sluggish whirlpool. Lowell's screen door clicked shut behind me, and I could almost hear Juniper's crayon scraping paper inside. I wanted to turn back, say something, anything, but my chest gave a tight little throb, and the thought of explaining why I'd scheduled a cardiology consult felt like admitting defeat. Better to let him think I was cold than fragile. I started down the cracked sidewalk toward the park at the corner. The swing set stood empty, its chains creaking gently in the breeze. The morning sun was sharp and low, catching in the beads of water on the slide, and for a moment I just watched the neighborhood breathe, rooftops steaming slightly. A dog barking 2 streets over. I pulled the pocket watch out again, feeling its warmth from my hand, the glass face perfect and unmarred. For a reason I couldn't name, I thought of how easily things break, even when you hold them close. The breakfast replayed in my mind as I walked. Lowell had been balancing Juniper on his knee while scrolling through job postings on his phone. His egg sat untouched, cooling on the plate, and I'd sat across from him like a stranger, sipping coffee that had already gone lukewarm. When he finally spoke, it was like a dam bursting, not loud, but forceful. You can make time for a doctor, but not your own granddaughter. I'd opened my mouth ready to say something about the tightness in my chest last week, but the words stuck. What would I even tell him? That at 54, with 3 decades at the same firm, I was suddenly scared of my own heartbeat. I made it to the park bench near the swings and sat brushing a thin layer of frost off the wooden slats. The wind rustled through a pile of leaves beside me, and I found myself counting my breath slow and deliberate, like the cardiologist had told me on the phone. Could just be stress, she'd said. I hoped she was right. Still, I couldn't shake the image of Lowell's face, brows knitted, jaw tight, not as angry as hurt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was hiding behind excuses because I didn't know how to bridge the years that had stretched between us. That's when my phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. A voicemail from Myra at the office. Her voice was clipped, almost rehearsed. Callum, we need to talk about something in the pension files. Today. Don't wait. No details, no explanation, just that pause at the end. Like she wanted to say more, but didn't. The wind carried the faint smell of a neighbor's fireplace wood smoke, curling in the crisp air, and I felt the weight of both worlds, family and work, pressing on my shoulders at once. I closed my eyes, fingers curled around the pocket watch again, its surface warm now, despite the chill. Tick-tick. For a second, I almost wished it would stop, just so everything else would too. Instead, I opened my eyes, staring at the distant rooftops, and wondered what exactly Myra had found, and how much more could crack before the day was over. The spreadsheets didn't lie, but they could end me if I dared to speak. The glow from my monitor made the frost on the window behind me shimmer like a sheet of ice, and for a moment I imagined myself trapped under it, every breath a little shallower than the last. The office smelled like burnt coffee and overworked toner, a scent that clung to the stale air, no matter how many windows we cracked. The fluorescent lights hummed in a tone that always seemed to sit somewhere between migraine and resignation. It was past 9 and the cubicles were mostly dark. Myra stood 2 rows over arms, crossed, her reflection faint in the glass partition. She didn't say much, she never did when the stakes felt high. But when she passed my desk earlier, she'd whispered, "Don't stay too long on those retirement logs, Callum. Some signatures aren't worth staring at." Her eyes darted toward the corner office where Senior VP Lowell, no relation to my son, kept his blinds drawn, even after hours. A name like that, scrawled across transfers to accounts I'd never seen before, was the kind of thing that kept accountants up at night. I scrolled through the ledger again, my fingers cold despite the heat blowing from the vent above. Entire accounts reclassified, backdated edits, transfers, bundled under innocuous labels like adjustment or liquidity buffer. To anyone else, they might look like routine movements. To me, they screamed manipulation. 30 years in this field, and I'd never seen numbers sing so loudly while everyone pretended to be deaf. Lowell, my Lowell, texted twice that evening. The first, "Can you take Juniper Saturday?" The second, 40 minutes later. "Never mind, don't worry about it." I didn't reply to either. The phone vibrated beside my keyboard, and I just stared at it, feeling the gulf between us widen with every unreturned message. I told myself I was protecting him by staying quiet, by not letting these anomalies swallow my entire life, but mostly I think I was too tired to bridge two crises at once. Myra stopped by my desk again, a faint outline in the dim aisle light. "You should go home," she murmured. Her fingers tapped once on the edge of my desk. Tap, pause, tap, as if to underline the warning. Then she walked off, coat slung over her shoulder, heels soft against the carpet. I watched her go, wondering how much she knew and how much she was willing to pretend she didn't. I slipped a USB drive from my drawer, the tiny blue indicator light blinking like a secret heartbeat, and saved the altered logs. My lunch thermos sat empty on the corner of my desk, so I unscrewed the lid and slid the drive inside, tucking it beneath the false bottom I'd cut weeks ago. The metal felt cold against my fingertips as I sealed it. I wasn't sure whether I was being careful or paranoid, but in this place the line blurred quickly. Halfway through exporting another set of files, I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the corridor. My supervisor, a man with the expression of someone perpetually smelling something sour, stopped by my desk. His eyes flicked to my screen, where columns of pension codes glowed in faint green. I closed the window with a practiced click, heart hammering in my chest, like I'd been caught stealing instead of doing my job. He didn't say a word, just grunted and shuffled toward the copier, leaving a faint trail of cologne and suspicion behind. When I finally powered down my computer, the hum of the office seemed louder than usual, like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I pulled on my coat, the static crackling in the dry winter air, and made my way to the elevator. My phone buzzed again, this time with a company-wide memo. The subject line was plain, but the message carried a weight heavier than the night air. Department restructuring, preliminary notices coming next week. The elevator door slid shut, and I caught my reflection in the brushed metal, tired, eyes stiff posture. A man clutching a thermos, like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. I pressed the button for the lobby, watching the floor numbers tick down, each one feeling like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. I hadn't seen Ephraim Blodgett in a decade, and yet there he was, hunched over a chipped mug of black coffee at the corner booth of Dale's roadside diner. The rain outside smeared the neon sign into a crimson blur, making the windows look like they were bleeding light. I had stopped here to get away from my own thoughts, away from the spreadsheets. The frozen smiles in the office, the silent judgment from Lowell's eyes when we passed each other at family dinners. But seeing Ephraim with his familiar worn suit, and the way his tie never quite sat straight, felt like being yanked back into a part of my life I hadn't planned to revisit. The jukebox, a relic with cracked chrome edges, sputtered mid-song as I slid into the booth across from him. 1 second, a soft Patsy Cline hum, the next, a skip, a stutter, and then a jarring silence. It felt like a warning, like something stable was about to give way. Ephraim noticed my glance toward it and gave a low chuckle, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue that seemed etched into his face. "That thing's been skipping since '92. Dale refuses to replace it. Says it gives the place character." I didn't smile, not really. "What brings you here? I thought you'd traded all this for church fundraisers and retirement speeches." He lifted his mug, swirling what little remained. "I did. But even saints need caffeine and a decent BLT now and then. You, on the other hand, You look like a man counting the cracks in his own floorboards. I stared at the condensation pooling at the base of my water glass, tracing it absently with a fingertip. My chest felt tight, not the kind that made me clutch at myself, but the kind that made every breath feel like it had to be earned. Things at the firm aren't smooth. There are numbers that don't add up, transfers that reek of someone higher up getting sloppy. I've been saving copies, but it's like digging in sand. The more I hold, the faster it all slips. Ephraim leaned forward, his elbows resting on the sticky linoleum. The waitress passed by, topping off both our coffees without asking, the smell of bacon fat and burnt toast drifting behind her. Callum, you've always had a spine even when no one noticed. Remember the Reading case? You held your ground while everyone else folded. But here's the truth: if you're going to sink, at least leave a buoy for someone to find. A breadcrumb trail they can't ignore. His words stuck to me like the smell of fryer oil in my coat. A buoy. Something to outlast me if the company decided to make me the scapegoat. I glanced at my phone on the table, the screen dim but waiting. A buoy, I repeated, my voice softer than I intended. Weekly emails, timed releases, encrypted. So if they cut me loose, the truth still floats. Ephraim nodded once satisfied. Make sure it's clean. No personal chatter. Nothing they can use to spin you as desperate or bitter. And Callum, his gaze held mine steady and unflinching. This isn't about revenge. It's about not letting them rewrite the story after they've erased you. Outside, the rain intensified, rattling against the diner windows in uneven bursts. I opened my laptop, the diner's free Wi-Fi, sluggish but functional, and began piecing together a chain of drafts. Each message would hold fragments, altered ledgers, approval chains, dates no one could argue with. I scheduled the first to send a week later, then another and another, each one set to release automatically, unless I manually stopped them. It felt like laying bricks in a wall I hoped I'd never have to hide behind. When Ephraim finally stood sliding a few crumpled bills under his mug, I felt lighter and heavier all at once. You'll be fine, Callum, he said, tugging his coat collar up against the drizzle outside. But fine doesn't mean safe. Don't forget that. I lingered after he left, finishing my coffee as the jukebox sputtered back to life with a warbled Hank Williams tune. Across the street, a dark sedan idled with its lights on the wipers swiping rhythmically, even though the rain had eased. It didn't move when I stepped outside, didn't budge when I fished for my keys. I could feel its presence like static on my skin. As I unlocked my car, I told myself it was nothing, a commuter finishing a call, a driver waiting for someone inside. Still, I couldn't shake the chill that crept up my spine, settling in deeper than the spring drizzle ever could. My watch slipped from my hand and hit the marble floor, the sound sharp enough to slice through the murmur of the lobby. The glass splintered in a spiderweb pattern light from the recessed ceiling bulbs, catching on each crack. I crouched to pick it up, feeling the cold marble seep into my knees as a faint tang of lemon polish clung to the air. For a second, I just stared at the damage my reflection warped across the broken face, and thought, so that's it. There goes the last thing in my life that still felt intact. It was autumn, though the trees outside the tinted windows hadn't yet turned. The air inside the building carried no season, only the sterile scent of cleaning agents and burnt coffee from a nearby kiosk. I'd been called in for a brief discussion with management, which I knew was a euphemism for something heavier. Myra was already there when I arrived, leaning against the reception desk, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. The elevator doors opened with a ding that sounded too cheerful for the morning that awaited. Lowell, the senior VP, not my son, but the man who could end my career with a single signature, stood near the conference room doorway. His suit was immaculate, but his tie was slightly askew, and his eyes had the frantic gleam of someone balancing too many debts, both financial and moral. He gestured me in without a word, the thin lines around his mouth twitching like a frayed wire. The conference room was windowless, painted a shade of gray that matched the mood. I set a folder of copied transfer records on the polished table, sliding them toward him. You know these aren't mistakes, I said, keeping my voice even. Funds routed through ghost accounts, approvals without the mandatory dual signatures. I'm not here to burn the place down, Lowell. Fix it quietly and I walk away. No lawyers, no noise. He didn't touch the folder. His fingers drummed once-twice against the tabletop. "You think you're doing the company a favor?" His voice was low but taut, like a chord stretched to breaking. "Drop it, Callum, walk away. Or you won't just lose your job, you'll lose every bridge you've got left. Friends, recommendations. Even Myra won't answer your calls." Myra flinched at the mention of her name, but kept her gaze fixed on the floor. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence between us, sounding louder than it should have. I felt my pulse in my throat, a steady drumbeat I couldn't will away. I wanted to say more to remind Lowell that the company's pensioners weren't faceless numbers, but the words clung stubbornly to the back of my tongue. When I reached into my coat pocket for my watch, some nervous tick, I developed a need to feel its weight. My fingers slipped. It tumbled out, struck the floor, and the glass gave way with a brittle crack. For a moment, none of us moved. The shards caught the conference room light like tiny scattered stars. Lowell exhaled slowly, a near-silent whistle. "You should take that as a sign," he muttered. Then he nodded to the security guard who had appeared at the door as if on cue. "Escort Mr. Hensley out." The guard's grip on my elbow was firm, but not rough, steering me back through the lobby I'd just crossed. Myra trailed a few steps behind, as if tethered to me by invisible guilt. The polished floor gleamed beneath our shoes, reflecting our distorted shapes. As we passed reception, the desk attendant avoided eye contact, focusing instead on a stack of forms she didn't really need to sort. Outside, the autumn air felt heavier than it should have, thick with the scent of wet pavement and exhaust from idling cars. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my fingers still trembling, and saw the subject line: suspension notice, indefinite. No greeting, no explanation, just those words and a blank subject line, as if the company had decided I didn't even deserve the courtesy of context. I stood on the steps staring at the cracked watch in my hand, its hands still ticking despite the fractured glass. People streamed past, hurrying in and out of the building, their voices blurring into a distant hum. For a long moment, I wondered if this was how erasure felt, not sudden, but quiet and thorough, like ink slowly fading from a page. Somewhere deep in my coat, the weight of the USB drive pressed against my side, a reminder that I wasn't entirely powerless. But as the wind carried the faint scent of lemon polish out the front doors behind me, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe Lowell was right. Maybe every bridge I had left was already burning. The first automated email fired at midnight, carrying every spreadsheet I had locked away, and there was no way to stop it. I watched the progress bar blink on my screen, a slow-moving snake of blue pixels, as the wind outside pressed the branches of the old maple against my window. The blinds rattled with each gust, a soft percussion to accompany the storm building beyond my walls, and inevitably inside the company I once called home. I sat hunched over the desk in my small home office, the faint smell of stale instant coffee lingering from the cup I'd abandoned hours earlier. My hands trembled over the keyboard, not entirely from fear, but from the weight of what I'd set in motion. It wasn't just numbers and ledgers anymore. Every click, every attachment carried the potential to end careers, including my own, and yet I couldn't imagine taking it back. The phone buzzed, its vibrations skating across the wooden surface. Ephraim's voice, gravelly and unhurried, spilled through the line before I could even say hello. "Patience, Callum. Don't answer anything without a record. Let them chase you, not the other way around." He'd been calling nightly since I told him about the emails, his counsel, a lifeline I didn't know I needed. I could picture him even now, likely sitting in that same diner booth with his chipped mug of black coffee, shoulders hunched against the world, but eyes sharp as ever. Outside, the storm cracked with a distant roll of thunder. A sheet of rain slapped against the glass, briefly turning the streetlight into a blurred halo. I turned back to the computer, scrolling through the confirmation notices. Every one of my scheduled drops had gone to auditors I trusted, a few, even to independent journalists I'd never met but whose integrity Ephraim vouched for. The first replies were already trickling in, some cautious, some alarmed, all hungry for more. Then my phone lit up again. Not Ephraim this time, but Lowell. His text was short, almost primitive. "You'll regret this." No punctuation, no pretense. Just a threat, blunt and heavy, like a brick through a window. I stared at the words for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen before I set the phone face down, letting the glow fade. I opened the desk drawer and pulled out a fresh manila envelope. Inside, I slid a printed chain of emails, one of the cleanest, clearest examples of the pension anomalies. I wrote Ephraim's name on the front, my handwriting uneven, and sealed it with a strip of tape. The rough texture of the paper grounded me, a small reminder that some things still existed outside screens and servers. I planned to drop it off the next morning at his church, no questions asked. The landline rang, a relic I kept more out of habit than necessity. The voice on the other end was colder than the storm seeping through my rattling windows. "Mr. Hensley, this is legal from corporate. We need clarification regarding materials that were disseminated this evening. You are to make yourself available for a remote deposition within 48 hours. If you fail to comply, we'll have no choice but to seek immediate injunctive relief." The words dripped with rehearsed civility, like they'd already decided what punishment fit my crime. I didn't answer right away. My eyes drifted to the watch on the desk beside me, its cracked glass reflecting the dim glow of my desk lamp. The minute hand ticked forward with a faint stutter, and only then did I notice the hairline fracture creeping along its edge. A new wound layered atop the old one. The storm outside growled, rattling the window harder, as if to echo the tremor in my chest. I finally muttered, "I'll be there," and hung up. The room was quiet except for the rain and the soft, uneven tick of the watch. I reached for it, my fingers tracing the cracked glass, and for the first time since this began, I wondered if even surviving this would leave me in one piece. My son's voice cut through the static of the deposition line, sharp and trembling all at once. "Dad, what have you dragged us into?" His words didn't echo like they should have. The Zoom feed carried them flat, a lifeless vibration, against the low hum of other voices and the faint clicking of lawyers' keyboards. The screen was a grid of faces, most of them blank and pale in the sterile glow of office fluorescence, somewhere far from my living room. But Lowell's face, my own flesh and blood, filled my mind far more than the corporate counsel's cold stares. The cursor blinked on my mute button, like a metronome daring me to speak, daring me to break. I sat hunched in the middle of my living room blinds, drawn against the July heat, stacks of documents piled around me like brittle sandbags. The air smelled of reheated coffee and printer toner, a stale mix that clung to the back of my throat. The only real light came from a single desk lamp, casting everything in a tired amber that made the paper's edges glow as if they were smoldering. The deposition dragged on, methodical and needling. The corporate lawyer, a voice smooth as oiled leather, probed every detail of my evidence trail. "Hensley, can you confirm that these logs weren't altered after you obtained them? Can you explain why encrypted attachments were sent to third parties? Are you aware of the legal ramifications?" Each question was precise, polished like tiny chisels tapping at a fault line. I answered carefully, my voice steady, even as my eyes burned from the strain. We broke for 10 minutes. That's when my phone lit up with Lowell's name. Not the SVP Lowell from the boardroom, but my son. His voice ragged from whatever storm he was weathering. "You're tearing everything apart," he said, not even greeting me. "My hours just got cut. They're saying we're all under review because of you. Juniper doesn't understand why I'm always angry. What are you doing to us?" I didn't know how to answer. My tongue felt thick, like the words would betray me no matter what I chose. I wanted to tell him about the watch, the emails, the nights I spent clutching my chest, wondering if the next morning would even come, but all I managed was a quiet, "I'm trying to make it right." The Zoom chime pulled me back before he could reply. Ephraim's small window was there too, his face still and calm, framed by the muted beige walls of some church office. He didn't speak, he never did during these calls, but he nodded once, slow and deliberate. When the corporate lawyer began again, I felt that nod like a brace tightening around my spine. His voice had carried a reminder earlier that morning, over a brief private call: truth costs, but so does silence. I reached for the last card I had. On screen, I shared a final video file, a time-stamped clip from the security cameras near the executive suite. It showed Lowell, the SVP, not my son, signing off digital approvals, while the system clock displayed a time when he'd sworn he was in another state. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to slice through their practiced denials. For a moment the line went silent, save for the faint tapping of someone's keyboard as they scrambled to recalibrate. Mr. Hensley, the lawyer, finally said, voice colder. Now this changes the scope of these proceedings considerably. I could almost hear the tension humming through their muted microphones. As the call ended for the day, my phone buzzed again, another Lowell. The executive's text was blunt. We all go down if this goes public. Choose carefully. The words glowed on the screen, stark against the dim light of my living room, while the muted cursor on the deposition app still blinked as if waiting for me to speak. I leaned back in the chair, the stale scent of cold coffee mixing with the faint ozone hum from the electronics around me. My hand drifted to the cracked watch on the desk, its fractured glass catching the lamp's glow like a fractured halo. For a second, I wondered if I'd just nudged us all over a cliff, or finally found the ledge I'd been clinging to. The silence after the verdict wasn't relief. It was a hollow ringing in my ears, the kind that doesn't fade even when the room empties. My name was cleared, at least on paper, but I knew that the ledger of my life now carried a permanent mark. No one was calling to offer me work, and the company's polite settlement had the weight of a dismissal wrapped in a handshake. That night back home, I found a drawing on my desk. Juniper had been by earlier, and I hadn't even noticed. A crayon sketch, shaky but vivid, a watch cracked down the middle, colored with a streak of bright yellow, as if someone had tried to tape it together. She didn't know how much that image mirrored what I felt. By October, Ephraim had coaxed me into something I never would have agreed to before. The church basement was drafty and smelled faintly of overbrewed tea, but he moved through it with a quiet purpose, arranging folding chairs that creaked every time they were set down. They need guidance, he murmured, gesturing toward the stack of pamphlets on retirement savings and pension basics. And maybe you do too. I stood there, hands shoved deep in my coat pockets, watching the late afternoon light pool across the scuffed linoleum. My world had shrunk, but it hadn't vanished entirely. Juniper came with me one Thursday evening, curious about why her grandfather spent so much time in a cold basement with a handful of strangers. She didn't say much at first, just watched from a corner as I fumbled with a projector and Ephraim poured steaming cups of tea into mismatched mugs. Then when the last attendee left and the clatter of their chairs faded, she tugged at my sleeve. "Grandpa," she said softly, "can I fix your watch?" In her small hand was a strip of gold tape, something she must have scavenged from a craft kit. She held it up like it was a magic spell, her eyes shining with a kind of hope I hadn't felt in years. I looked at her, then at the broken watch resting in my palm. The crack in its glass caught the dim church light, splitting it into two pale rays that crossed my fingertips. The watch still ticked stubborn as ever, even if its face was scarred. My throat tightened, words sticking somewhere behind my ribs. I nodded, and she pressed the tape into my hand, her fingers warm against mine. The chairs creaked again as Ephraim folded the last one and stacked it against the wall. "Not everything needs to be perfect to keep time," he said, his voice more like a passing thought than advice. I slipped the watch into my pocket, feeling the rough edge of the tape against my thumb, unsure if I was ready to mend it or myself. As we left the basement, Juniper humming a tune under her breath, I glanced at the night sky through the narrow church windows. The stars were faint, barely visible above the town's glow, but they were there. My path forward wasn't clear, and maybe it never would be, but for the first time in years, the weight on my chest didn't feel so heavy. The watch ticked faintly in my pocket. Each beat a reminder that time, cracked as it might be, was still moving. 2 years later, I still wind the watch every morning, even with the thin strip of gold tape holding its glass together. The crack is there, faintly visible beneath the morning light, but I don't mind. When the sun streams through the blinds, it catches on that scar and throws a soft glimmer across my desk, like a quiet reminder that some breaks don't need to disappear to be whole again. The community center overlooks a green stretch of park, and on late spring mornings, the smell of grilled burgers from the fundraiser out front drifts in through the propped-open doors. I stand at the front of a modest room, facing a dozen retirees and soon-to-be retirees, flipping through slides about pension safeguards and red flags. My voice is steadier these days, not loud, but calm enough that people lean in to listen. Ephraim sits in the back, arms folded, a faint smile flickering every time someone asks a question I once would have brushed off. Lowell shows up halfway through, sliding into a chair in the second row, his arms crossed like a barrier. I don't call attention to him, just keep talking, tracing a finger along a chart that shows how tiny discrepancies can grow into disasters if left unchecked. When the session ends and the chairs begin their usual chorus of creaks, he lingers by the door. "Dad," he says, voice quieter than I remember. I didn't know about your health back then, or any of this. I just thought you were choosing work over us." He doesn't meet my eyes at first, then adds, "I'm sorry," I nod, not trusting myself to say much. Words feel brittle in moments like these, and I've learned not to force them. Instead, I glance down at Juniper, now 11, perched on a folding chair, with her sketchbook open. She looks up and grins, holding out her latest creation, a drawing of the watch fully repaired, no crack. The gold tape replaced by a gleaming band of yellow, she's turned into sunlight. "For you," she says. "It's how I see it now." I take the page, the rough crayon texture catching against my fingertips. "Thank you," I manage, my voice catching in a way I hope she doesn't notice. I fasten the real watch around my wrist, the repaired glass cool against my skin. For the first time since it broke, I wear it openly, letting its faint tick mark the moments without shame. As the crowd filters out, a sudden breeze sweeps in from the open doors, scattering a stack of workshop flyers across the room. Pages skitter along the linoleum, brushing against chair legs and my shoes. I stoop to gather them, laughing under my breath. As I chase the last one toward the door, a reflex I haven't felt in years, lighter and freer than the deadlines I used to chase. Outside, the smell of burgers thickens in the warm air, mingling with the sound of kids shouting in the park. I glance back at the room, Ephraim adjusting his jacket, Lowell helping Juniper pack her pencils, and I realize I'm not carrying that old weight anymore. The watch ticks steadily on my wrist, each beat soft but certain, and for once I don't feel the urge to measure what's next. Time scarred and mended is moving, and I'm content to move with it. The gold-taped watch feels lighter now, its steady tick blending with the fading hum of a spring fundraiser outside the community center. I've learned that justice doesn't always roar. It often arrives quietly in repaired bonds and second chances. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can see which ones are truly worth rebuilding. For anyone facing layoffs, health scares, or family rifts, there's still a way forward if you're willing to pause, mend, and keep moving. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story or just stay a while and listen. Sometimes that's where the healing begins.